Charles and Emma welcomed a beautiful baby girl into the world on March the 2nd, 1841. In fact, as her father and mother described her, they said that she was the joy of their household. Said she was always a bright, happy child. At age 8, she was stricken with scarlet fever. She tried to get better, but never fully did. And on April the 23rd, 1851, she died. 8 years later, Charles published his book on the origin of species by natural selection that was immediately a bestseller. Publishers bought all 1,200 copies of it hot off the press the very week it was published. And from that time until this, Darwinism has been one of the most often taught ideas in the scientific community. They asked Darwin if he believed in God. He said he did not, and his belief in a God gradually eroded. The biographers who have studied his life said that the event in his life that destroyed his faith, that destroyed his concept of a God, the only earned degree Darwin ever had was in theology, said the event was when he lost his daughter. Little Annie, at age 10, Darwin said, how could a loving God allow a child that bright and happy and shining to leave this world? And so, he gave up his belief in God. Do you know that if you were to ask most people who no longer believe in God, what is the number one reason why that's the case? The vast majority of them will explain to you that they just don't see how an all-loving, all-powerful God can allow the suffering that goes on in this world. It's been called the problem of evil, pain, and suffering. Now, it's not new. In fact, it's ages and ages old. There was a Greek philosopher by the name of Epicurus. And Epicurus said, we've come into a philosophical quandary. He said, there are three statements that don't seem like they can all be correct. There's an all-loving God who's all-powerful, and there is evil. He said, either there's a God who is all-loving, but he can't change the situation, and he's not all-powerful, or there's a God who's all-powerful, but he doesn't really care all that much about you. He doesn't really love you, but you can't say there's an all-powerful God who is all-loving and there still be the kind of pain and suffering we see in this world. That's what he said in about the 3rd century BC. Is that right? You know, a guy by the name of Dan Barker, he's the co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Freedom from Religion Foundation has about 18,000 signed up members, if I understand it correctly, one of the largest groups of unbelievers in the nation out of Madison, Wisconsin. Dan Barker is very fond of saying that all you have to do to see that the God of the Bible does not exist is to go into any children's hospital across the country, and you see the pain and the suffering and the sickness and the death that's in that children's hospital, and you know there's no God. Sounds like a fairly powerful argument. Until you start to put it to the test. Is it true that when you see the pain and suffering and sickness and death, you just are forced to the conclusion that there's not a God? I was in South Carolina for a debate with Dan Barker in 2009, and they have a children's hospital there, and I went to the children's hospital there, and I was going to ask around, talk to some of the people there. There was a lady there, I think she was in her mid-50s, and she was a volunteer there at the children's hospital. I started talking to her, and I asked her why she volunteered. Why did she put herself in that position where she would see that pain and sickness and death so often? And I was taken aback when she put her head forward and flipped her hair over, and she said, "Do you see that right there?" I leaned forward, and there was a hole in her head about the size of a nickel. She said, "That is from a .38 caliber bullet that came through my living room in a drive-by shooting and struck me in the back of the head." She said, "I should be dead, but I'm not." In fact, she said, when I realized that the Lord, she said, had kept me alive, and she attributed it to the Lord, she said, I felt like I needed to give back. And so that's why I started volunteering at this children's hospital. I said, let me ask you a question. I said, would you say that most of the volunteers and the people in this hospital believe in God, actively worship God? She said, oh, far and away, absolutely. Most of them all do. Do you know the idea that somehow when you look at pain and suffering, it just forces you philosophically to the conclusion that there's no God? That's just false. It's not true. In fact, one of the things that the unbelieving community simply cannot answer is why anyone would ever work in a children's hospital. Let me explain. If there is no God, and we are all here as a product of blind chance processes over multiplied millions of years, and you have one job according to this atheistic idea, and that job is for you to pass on your genetic material to the next generation. Well, then you wouldn't waste your time trying to help someone who is not going to further your mission in this life, and that's pass on your genetic material. You know, one of the things that the atheistic community simply cannot answer is why in the world a person would volunteer her time to help a child who is sick, and that person gets no return from that physically and spends hours and hours to help a child that's not going to live, in many cases very long, and will never pass on that person's genetic information. The unbelieving community can't explain why anyone would love someone that can't help them. It's inexplicable to them. In fact, as C.S. Lewis was working through his atheism, he said, I felt like some stuff was wrong with the world. It just seemed like we were suffering, and there was some injustice that went on, that people were mistreating other people, that there was something wrong. He said, but then I started to think through it. And he said, where had I gotten this idea of just or unjust? He said, I could say that it was a personal fancy of mine. It was just an idea that I had. But then I could never say something was absolutely right and absolutely wrong. He said, either there is something wrong with the world or there's not. If there's something wrong with the world, there has to be a standard by which we could judge that. And he said, subsequently, atheism is just too simple. It can't explain how we know that there are things wrong with this world. It just can't do that for you. Philosophically, it's just not a problem for the Christian. The supposed problem of pain and suffering, you could put it like this in a syllogism. If there is no God, then there is no objective moral values. Evil exists. Evil is an objective moral value, thus God exists. Now you could do that. You could get rid of the philosophical problem immediately, but then we would need to go to the emotional problem, wouldn't we? Now, we can lay it out and show that, hey, philosophically, the idea of suffering is not a problem for the God of the Bible. But you know what? It still hurts, doesn't it? It's still painful. It's still something on a gut level, on an emotional level, we've got to deal with. You've got to do something with your reaction that when you go into a children's hospital, you do see that pain and that suffering. You got to do something with the fact that, yes, there was a 10-year-old little girl named Annie who was bright and shining and she died. Does that force you emotionally to the conclusion that there's no God? It doesn't. Let me illustrate. A man by the name of Horatio Spafford. Horatio Spafford was an extremely successful lawyer in the Chicago area. He was planning to do some investing, so in 1871 he invested most of his money in real estate. That was in 1871. If you know much history about Chicago, maybe you know the song about Miss O'Leary that talks about the Great Fire of 1873. Almost every single thing that Horatio Spafford had invested in was burned 2 years later. And so Horatio Spafford and his family decided that they were going to go on vacation. They were going to try to get over their losses and try to reconnect as a family. They were scheduled to go to England. For some reason, they had some business that didn't get taken care of. So Mr. Spafford put his wife, Anna, and his 4 daughters on the Ville du Havre to go across the ocean. They were going to take some time in England. In a freak accident, the Ville du Havre was struck by a steamer and 226 people died in the crash. Horatio Spafford got a telegram from his wife that consisted of 2 words, saved alone. His 4 daughters died in that shipwreck. He immediately got on a boat, traversed the very same ocean that his daughters had lost their lives in. And he wrote something. It goes something like this: when peace like a river attends my way, when sorrow like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, you have taught me to say, it is well with my soul. You've probably sung that song many times. Did you know it was written by a man at the time who was going over the same portion of ocean that his 4 daughters had died in just days before? You see, the emotional problem of suffering is a problem for us because we often forget the purpose of our lives. You know, when you forget the purpose of your life, you're going to have a real problem accepting and dealing with the pain and suffering that comes into it. Now, let me explain to you what happens when you miss the purpose of your life. You see, many of us think that the purpose that we're here for, the reason that God put us here, is because we need to be comfortable. We think that we're kind of like God's little pets, and, you know, God needs to take care of his little pets, doesn't he? My daughter has a little hamster. She named it Butterbeer, and she feeds it little yogurt treats, and she makes sure it's got a clean cage, and she sprays it with the little spray for hamsters, and it just gets such good care from my 10-year-old daughter, Anna Claire. And, you know, we are kind of like that. We kind of feel like God needs to just make sure we're taken care of. As long as we have a clean cage and we have plenty of food and water, and every now and then get us a little yogurt treat or something. Every now and then get us a Starbucks Frappuccino for $12 or whatever it is. We just need to be taken care of. And then if something happens where we're not getting taken care of, we look up at our pet keeper and we say, what? I thought we had a deal. Look, I thought you took care of me, made sure everything went right in my life, and when that doesn't happen, you and I are going to have a problem. You see, we misunderstand the point of our lives. You know, the point of your life is not to live a comfortable life until you're 85 and die in your sleep. That's not why you're here. Let me explain to you what happens when you miss the point of your life. If you were to walk into my kitchen, there's a little wrought iron piece of furniture in the corner. On that wrought iron piece of furniture, there's a bowl. And in that bowl are 3 of the most beautiful pears you've ever seen. Now, if you were to go and get those pears, and you were to pick one of them up, and you were to take a big bite out of one of those pears, you would immediately spit it out. You know why? Because that pear is styrofoam. Now, if you were to come to me and say, Kyle, this pear is useless. I can't believe you would put a pear on your table that you can't eat. I would say you're misunderstanding the purpose of the pear. You see, the purpose of that pear is for decoration, not consumption. What's the purpose of your life? You see, Paul summed it up very well in Philippians chapter 1. In verses 20 and 21, he said, according to my earnest expectation and hope that in nothing shall I be ashamed, but as always, so now also, Christ may be magnified in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ, but to die is gain. You see, we've gotten so used to thinking that we're not supposed to suffer any type of pain and trial and tribulation, that when it happens, we look at God and we say, hold on just a second. What's the problem? You know, Peter said over in 1 Peter chapter 4, you start in about verse 13 and following, he said, don't think it strange concerning the fiery trial that is to try you, as though something strange is happening to you, but rejoice to the extent that you get to partake of the same sufferings of Christ. Now ask this question, who goes through life ever and doesn't suffer? Nobody. You see, and lots of times the skeptic wants to take away from us the only thing of value in suffering, and that's that suffering can help us have meaning in this life. Oh, it's interesting to listen to Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Near the end, he said, we don't lose heart, but even though our outward man is perishing, our inward man is being renewed day by day. And then it's almost like you want to laugh when Paul makes this next statement, because he said, for our light affliction, which is but for a minute, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. Our light affliction? Oh yeah, you remember what happened to Paul. He was beaten with rods multiple times. He was stoned to the point of death. A night and a day he spent in a deep. He was whipped by Jews at least 3 times, 39 lashes. He was thrown into a Philippian prison. He was killed, as legend tells us, by Nero and Paul's light affliction. What about yours? Are you using the suffering that comes into your life to change you, to form you, to direct your attention to becoming a stronger person? C.S. Lewis said God talks to us through His Word. He whispers to us in our pleasures, and He screams to us in our pain. He said pain is God's megaphone to wake a slumbering world. You go over to James chapter 1, and the text says, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. Now stop right there, and let's look at what he is trying to say. What in the world does he mean when he says, count it all joy when you fall into various trials? I teach James to seniors at Mars Hill, and I try to show them the difference between joy and happiness. Happiness being the idea of a fleeting emotional state that is mostly concerned with what happens today. Now, let me ask you to do this with me. Can you try to think of your best day? Now, I'll give it to you kind of like this. Suppose that you're 16 and you come down the stairs and your dad says, 16 years old today, son. 16 years old today, daughter. We'll use son in this situation. He says, you know, being 16, I thought you might like a new Ford Raptor. Dual cab, brand new, right off the lot. Here are the keys. Now, I was talking to my girls there in senior class, and I was saying, probably you girls might not want a Ford Raptor. What would you want? And one of the girls said, a brand new white Range Rover. All right, okay, so whatever it is that you're wanting, you come downstairs, your dad says, all right, here you go, brand new, you're 16 years old today, it's your birthday. Oh, and by the way, your mom fixed you a pound of bacon that nobody else in the family is going to eat any of it. You get the whole thing. And it's just exactly like you like it cooked. In my case, that would be right in between crispy and floppy. Just right there, where the little pieces of the edge are perfect when you eat them. You know what I'm talking about? And you're thinking, this is a great day. So let's say you're the son. You've just gotten your new Ford Raptor. You've eaten all of your bacon. You go to school and there's this ball game you're playing. It just so happens that it's the state championship basketball game. Now, you're not a starter. In fact, you don't ever get to play. You sit on the bench most of the time, but the coach comes up to you and he says, I've seen you've been doing a lot of improving. You're going to start for our state championship, state tournament tonight. Do you want to do that? You say, sure, absolutely. And you get in that game that evening, and Steph Curry wishes he had the shot you had. And what 10 out of 15 from Steph Curry pales in comparison to the 20 for 21 three-point shots that you shoot. You go 65 points, and you're still down by one. There's 1 second left. It's your birthday. You got a new Ford Raptor. You ate a pound of bacon, and you're starting and just scored 60 points. They throw the ball in. It looks like there's no possible way you can get it. The throw was errant. You're going out of bounds. I've seen this happen. You grab it right here, behind the back, up 3/4 of the court, bottom for the win. You happy today? Oh, yeah, by the way, there was a girl that you had been thinking about asking out right after that shot. You come off the, everybody, I mean, they got you waving around. You look at your phone, oh, the girl, she wants to go out with you. It's great. You happy today? Oh, you're happy, aren't you? It's your 16th day after your birthday. You wake up, you obviously have pink eye because your eye is stuck together. You roll out of bed and crack your head on the dresser. You had talked to a basketball scout the night before who was going to sign you up to play, oh, let's just say it, Kentucky. Might as well be Kentucky. You're walking down your steps and compound fracture your hip bone in 12 places. You'll never play ball again. Your head's busted. You've got pink eye. You're never going to play ball again. And you feel that you have a fever. You come down with the flu. The flu, of all things, you just compound fractured your hip. You come down with the flu. You're driving to the hospital and you see that girl who texted you sitting with some other guy and he's got his arm around her. That's low down, isn't it? Low down. You happy today? No, you're not happy. Could you have joy on a day when your hip is compound fractured and your head is busted, you've got pink eye and the flu, and that girl you thought liked you is never going to talk to you again? Could you still have joy on a day like that? You could, couldn't you? Count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. You know why you can have joy like that on a day like that? Because a broken hip has nothing whatsoever to do with your relationship with God. If you're in a right relationship with God, you're still going to heaven, regardless if it's a compound fracture, regardless of your hip falls off. You having the flu has nothing whatsoever to do with your relationship with God. You see, it's not the suffering that you go through, it's how you decide to let the suffering form you and how you take it and use it to form your relationship with God. Did you know in 1919, there was the first statue ever built in honor of an agricultural pest? I saw the congregation from Enterprise, Alabama. You have probably seen this particular statue. You drive down the downtown center of Enterprise, Alabama, and in the middle of the downtown main street, there is a statue of a woman who looks like the Statue of Liberty, and she's holding up on her head a boll weevil. A boll weevil. You know what a boll weevil is? It's a little beetle that has a big long nose that gets inside of cotton bolls and kills them. In 1916, boll weevils came up from Mexico, and by 1917 and 18, demolished the cotton crop in Enterprise, Alabama. Why in the world would you make a statue to a beetle that demolished your cotton crop? Well, the people in Enterprise decided that they were going to start growing peanuts. They started growing peanuts and made more money growing peanuts than they ever made growing cotton, and they built a statue to the boll weevil to thank the boll weevil for destroying their cotton crops. Can God take the suffering that comes into your life, and if you allow Him to use it right, change you into something amazing through that suffering? There is one of the most interesting verses, I think, in all of the Bible that you're going to find in Hebrews chapter 5, verse 7. If you're reading Hebrews chapter 5 with me, verse 7, it's talking about Jesus, and here's what it says. Who in the days of His flesh, when He offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears, who was able to save him from death. Now watch this next part of this verse. And was heard because of His godly fear. Well, hold on just a second. That's not making any sense. You remember when Jesus was in the garden and He's offering up those tears and He's vehemently crying out to God? Do you remember what His prayer was? Father, please let this cup pass from me. This is talking about that instance, and what does the text say? He was heard. No, that can't be the right conclusion. No, He ended up going to the cross. How could He have been heard if He still went through the suffering? Oh, and then you read the next verse. Though He were a son, yet learned He obedience by the things which He suffered. If it's good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for us. Let me tell you about a man. His name is Terry Purdom. I know Terry because I've been down to the Northwest Church of Christ in the Dallas, Texas area. Terry currently is the director of happiness at the largest Harley-Davidson motorcycle distribution center in the country. They sell about 175 Harley-Davidsons every month. He's the director of happiness. He's about 6'4". wears Harley Davidson stuff, has a smile on his face all of the time. Let me tell you why he has a smile on his face all of the time. It's not because he's employed at the Harley Davidson that sells more Harley Davidsons than any place in the country. Let me tell you why. He grew up with a mother who taught him all about what God wanted him to do until he was 18 years old. Then he checked into the military and checked out of God's service. For the next 30 years, he will tell you that it pains him to remember the things that he did that he knew he should not have done for those 30 years. He lived a profligate, reprobate life, and he'd tell you in just about every sense of the word. On November 22nd, he was 49 years old. He went into the hospital. They took a bone marrow biopsy. They came out with the results and they explained to him, you have multiple myeloma. It's incurable. You'll have it for the rest of your life, and we don't know how long that life will be. Could be very short. He checked out of the hospital. 2 weeks later, his mother died. 2 weeks later, he had recovered enough from the treatment that he had taken while in the hospital that he went back to his job. The day that he went back to his job, his employers, he was making a six-figure salary, explained to him that they no longer needed his services. He was diagnosed with a cancer he would have for the rest of his life, not knowing how long that life would be. He lost his mother and he lost his job in a period of 3 weeks. Terry was writing me an email. I asked him to relate his story to me, and here's what he said. I thank God for my cancer because it saved my spiritual life. He said, you know, when I got my cancer, my mom asked me to come back to church, and I didn't give it much thought. When my mom died, I started thinking that I might need to start getting my life right, but I pushed it to the back. He said, I am convinced that had it not been for me being diagnosed with cancer, losing my mom, and losing my job, I would not have stopped long enough to let my suffering push me to my God. Terry Purdom thanks God for his cancer. What do you have to thank God for in your life? You know what I always say, how I always end this type of a discussion, is if you ever wonder where your God is in your suffering, you look at the life of Jesus Christ and watch our Lord cry and scream to God to allow the cup to pass from him, and God hears him. And then the text says, and because of his faithfulness, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him. Use your suffering to let God use you. Let's pray. Great God, you are awesome. It is amazing to us that you have decided to send your Son to buy us back from sin and to make us useful workers in your kingdom. Lord, we know that our purpose in this life is to bring glory to you. It's not to be comfortable. It's not to live a long time. It's to bring glory to you through everything that we do in our body. We ask that you'll please help us to have wisdom, to count it all joy when we fall into various trials. And we ask that you'll please help us to always feel your presence and know that you are with us. You are suffering and crying with us through everything that we go through. Please help us always to look to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him went to be crucified in our stead. We ask that you'll bless every single one of the 12,500 people here tonight. Please help them to use their pain, use their suffering to get closer to you and bring glory to your name. It's through Christ we pray. Amen.